A homeless Navy SEAL bought a rusted Mustang for $600. Then his dog uncovered a secret hidden for 20 years. A homeless Navy SEAL paid $600 for a 1965 Mustang. His dog found a life-changing secret. Deep in the frozen mountains of Montana, former Navy SEAL Jack Mercer thought he was buying nothing more than an abandoned project car. But when his aging German shepherd, Shadow, became obsessed with the Mustang, a buried secret began to emerge, one that connected a fallen soldier, a grieving father, and a promise that refused to die. Comment 1 or 0 and tell us where you're watching from. The nightmare always began the same way. A dark valley, a distant explosion, a voice calling his name through smoke. Then silence. Jack Mercer jolted awake before dawn, his chest heaving as if he'd sprinted a mile uphill. For a few disoriented seconds, he didn't know where he was. His eyes darted around the darkness, searching for threats that no longer existed. Then reality slowly returned. The cracked wooden ceiling, the broken lantern hanging from a rusted nail, the cold mountain air slipping through gaps in the cabin walls. Montana. Not Afghanistan. Not the desert. Not the battlefield. Montana. A low whine came from beside the bed. Jack looked down. Shadow was already awake. The aging German shepherd lifted his gray-speckled muzzle and rested his head against Jack's knee. "It's okay, buddy," Jack whispered. The dog didn't move. He simply stayed there until Jack's breathing slowed, just like he always did. The cabin sat deep in the Bitterroot Mountains outside Elk Ridge, Montana. Calling it a cabin was generous. It had once been a hunting shack decades ago. Now it leaned slightly to one side. Half the roof had been patched with scrap metal. One window was covered with plywood. The wood stove smoked whenever the wind shifted. But it was dry. And for a man who had spent the last 2 years drifting between shelters, parking lots, and temporary jobs, dry was enough. Jack swung his legs off the bed. His knees cracked. At 39, he felt 60. Years of military service had left their mark. So had the things he carried inside his head. Shadow stood slowly. Age had begun catching up with him, too. The German shepherd's muzzle had turned silver. His gait wasn't as quick as it once was, but his eyes remained sharp. Always watching, always protecting, always there. Jack scratched behind the dog's ears. Let's see what the world wants from us today. Outside, dawn painted the mountains in pale shades of gold and blue. Pine trees stretched endlessly across the slopes. A thin mist hovered above the valley below. The beauty of Montana never stopped surprising him. Some mornings it felt like God himself had painted the landscape. Other mornings it felt like the wilderness was swallowing him whole. Today felt somewhere in between. He fed Shadow first, always. The dog ate from an old metal bowl, while Jack poured himself stale coffee left over from the day before. The bitter taste barely registered anymore. He sat on the porch steps and stared toward the distant town of Elk Ridge. The town wasn't much. One main street, a diner, a hardware store, a feed supply shop, a church, a gas station. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody. And everybody knew Jack Mercer, the homeless Navy SEAL living in the mountains with a German shepherd. Some pitied him, some respected him, a few avoided him. Jack preferred it that way. People were complicated. Dogs weren't. Shadow finished eating and sat beside him. The two watched the sunrise in silence. Then Jack checked his wallet. 3 $20 bills. Nothing else. $60. That was all he had left. His next odd job wouldn't pay until the following week. The math wasn't encouraging. He sighed. Shadow glanced up at him. The dog always seemed to know when something was wrong. "You got any investment advice, partner?" Shadow thumped his tail once. Jack laughed despite himself. The first genuine laugh he'd managed in days. By mid-morning, he was driving his battered pickup toward town. The truck rattled over the mountain road like it might fall apart at any moment. Shadow sat in the passenger seat. His head rested against the window. The dog loved rides, always had. The diner bell jingled as Jack entered. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air. For a moment, it almost felt like normal life. Almost. Martha, the owner, smiled from behind the counter. "Morning, Jack." "Morning. The usual?" "You know it." She poured coffee before he even sat down. Shadow settled beneath the booth. Several locals nodded as Jack entered. A few veterans, a rancher, the retired sheriff, people who had learned not to ask too many questions. Halfway through breakfast, the diner door opened. A broad-shouldered ranch hand named Curtis entered. He spotted Jack immediately. "Mercer." Jack looked up. "Morning." Curtis slid into the booth opposite him. "You still looking for old project cars?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "Depends. My uncle's got something sitting behind his cattle ranch." Jack shrugged. "Most project cars around here are worth less than the weeds growing through them." Curtis chuckled. "This one's a Mustang." That got Jack's attention. A Mustang? 1965. Jack blinked. Even Shadow lifted his head. "What's wrong with it?" Curtis laughed. "Everything." The table erupted with chuckles. "Been sitting 20 years. Rust? Tons. Engine? Probably seized. Interior? Mice own it." The laughter continued, but Jack's curiosity had already awakened. A 1965 Mustang, even buried under rust, even forgotten. That was something. Curtis took a sip of coffee. "Uncle wants $600. Jack nearly choked. "600? Yep. Why? Because nobody's dumb enough to pay more." The table laughed again. Jack didn't. Something stirred deep inside him. Not logic, not practicality. Something older, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Dangerous hope. The kind that got people hurt. He spent the rest of breakfast trying to ignore it. By noon, he found himself driving toward the ranch anyway. The Hollow Creek Ranch sat 20 miles west of Elk Ridge. Rolling pasture land stretched beneath towering mountains. Hundreds of cattle grazed beneath enormous skies. Curtis's uncle met him at the gate. The old rancher introduced himself simply as Earl. No nonsense, no small talk. He pointed toward an old barn. "She's back there." Jack walked through the weathered structure. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. Broken equipment sat forgotten in corners. Then he saw it. The Mustang. Even beneath decades of neglect, it was beautiful. The body was scarred with rust. One tire had collapsed completely. The paint had faded beyond recognition. Spiderwebs covered the mirrors. But it was still a Mustang. Still proud somehow. Still waiting. Jack slowly approached. His fingertips brushed the hood. Cold steel. Silent memories. A forgotten dream. Behind him, Shadow suddenly stopped. The German shepherd stared at the car, completely still. His ears rose. His posture changed. Jack noticed immediately. "What is it?" Shadow didn't answer. Of course he couldn't. But something about the dog felt different, focused, alert, almost fascinated. The old rancher laughed. "Funny dog." Jack kept watching Shadow. The dog slowly walked around the Mustang, one full circle, then another, sniffing, studying, watching, almost like he recognized it, which was impossible. Jack shook his head. You like it, buddy? Shadow sat beside the passenger door. His eyes never left the vehicle. The old rancher smiled. Looks like he's already bought it. Jack laughed softly. Then he looked back at the Mustang. $600. His last real money. A terrible decision. Maybe the worst financial choice of his life. Yet standing there beneath the old barn roof, something inside him refused to walk away. Maybe it was the memory of better days. Maybe it was the mechanic skills his father had taught him. Maybe it was the need to believe something broken could still be saved. Or maybe it was because he saw a little of himself in that rusted Mustang. Forgotten. Damaged. Left behind. But not completely gone. Jack took a slow breath, then extended his hand. You've got a deal. The old rancher stared. You serious? Jack nodded. Yeah. The man shook his hand. Well, I'll be damned. As they finalized the sale, Shadow remained beside the Mustang, watching, waiting. The dog never once looked away. And for the first time in years, Jack Mercer drove home carrying something more valuable than money. A dream. He didn't know it yet, but hidden inside that rusted Mustang was a secret that would change every remaining year of his life. And somehow, Shadow already seemed to know it. The trip back to the mountains took nearly 2 hours. The Mustang sat strapped to a borrowed trailer behind Jack's battered pickup, swaying gently along the winding roads that climbed through the Bitterroot Range. Pine-covered ridges rolled endlessly beneath a sky painted with streaks of orange and violet as evening settled across Montana. Jack glanced repeatedly into the rearview mirror. Not at the Mustang. At Shadow. The German Shepherd wasn't lying down as he usually did during long drives. He was sitting upright, watching the car. Every time Jack checked, Shadow's amber eyes remained fixed on the Mustang riding behind them. It was strange. Very strange. You're acting like that thing owes you money, Jack muttered. Shadow's ears twitched. That was the only response. The cabin appeared just before sunset. Its silhouette stood against the mountains like a stubborn survivor refusing to surrender to time. Jack parked beside the shed and climbed out. The air smelled of pine sap and cold earth. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried across the valley. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Normal. The kind of peace he always chased but rarely caught. He lowered the trailer ramps. The Mustang rolled carefully onto the dirt clearing beside the cabin. Its rusted body creaked softly. Old metal settling after years of neglect. Shadow approached immediately. The dog circled the vehicle. Once, twice, then a third time. His nose worked constantly, studying every inch, every scent, every shadow. Jack leaned against the fender and watched. You've met 1,000 cars in your life. Shadow ignored him. The dog stopped beside the passenger door. His head tilted slightly. Then he sniffed the air again. Something had his full attention. Something inside the car. Jack frowned. A mouse nest, maybe. The interior probably contained enough wildlife to qualify as protected habitat. Eventually, Shadow followed him inside for the night. But even during dinner, the dog remained distracted. He kept glancing toward the window overlooking the Mustang. Watching. Waiting. As darkness settled across the mountains, Jack fed the stove and settled into his chair. A worn notebook sat on the table beside him. Inside were job estimates, repair requests, bills. Too many bills. Not enough income. The familiar weight settled onto his shoulders. That constant pressure. The feeling of falling behind, no matter how hard he worked. He rubbed his eyes. The Mustang certainly hadn't helped his financial situation. $600. Gone. The last real money he had. Logic said he'd made a terrible decision, but another part of him disagreed. A quieter part. A part he hadn't listened to in years. Hope rarely sounded logical. Shadow suddenly stood. Jack looked up. The dog had moved to the front door. His ears were raised, his posture alert. Then came a low whine. Not fear, not warning. Curiosity. The sound repeated. Shadow stared directly toward the Mustang outside. What now? The dog whined again. Jack opened the door. Cold mountain air rushed inside. Moonlight silvered the clearing. The Mustang sat exactly where they'd left it. Silent. Still. Nothing unusual. Shadow trotted outside. Straight toward the car. Jack followed. The dog reached the passenger side, sniffed along the door, then moved toward the rear seat area. His tail stiffened. He pressed his nose against the glass and whined. Again. Jack crossed his arms. You smell mice? Shadow scratched lightly against the door, then sat, refusing to move. The behavior continued for nearly 10 minutes. Eventually, Jack convinced the dog to return inside, but the incident stayed with him. Something wasn't right. The next morning arrived cold and gray. Clouds hung low over the mountains. Jack loaded tools into his truck. The old sawmill garage at the edge of Elk Ridge had become his unofficial workshop over the past year. The owner, a retired mechanic named Warren Pike, let him use the space whenever it wasn't occupied. In exchange, Jack fixed equipment. A fair arrangement. By mid-morning, the Mustang sat beneath the garage's aging steel roof. Dusty sunlight filtered through broken windows. The scent of oil, wood, and old machinery filled the air. Shadow immediately jumped from the truck and headed straight for the Mustang. Again. The same behavior. The same focus. The same strange obsession. Jack opened the passenger door. A stale smell escaped. Dust, mold, age. The interior looked even worse in daylight. The seats were cracked. The carpet was stained. Mouse droppings littered the floorboards. Half the dashboard was missing. He got to work. Hours passed. Bolts loosened. Panels came off. Seats were removed. The steady rhythm of restoration slowly consumed his attention. For a while, he forgot everything else. Forgot bills. Forgot nightmares. Forgot Afghanistan. Just a man. A dog. And an old Mustang. Then the grinder started. The shrill metallic sound exploded through the garage. Instantly, everything changed. Jack froze. His pulse spiked. His chest tightened. The sound transformed. Not a grinder. Incoming fire. Not sparks. Tracer rounds. Not Montana. Afghanistan. The memory slammed into him without warning. Smoke. Chaos. Men shouting. A radio screaming. Blood on sand. Jack staggered backward. His breathing accelerated. The garage walls seemed to close around him. The familiar panic surged forward. Not now. Not here. Not again. A sharp bark shattered the memory. Shadow. The German shepherd stood directly in front of him, blocking his path. The dog pressed his body against Jack's legs, grounding him, anchoring him, bringing him back. Jack closed his eyes, focused on the dog's fur beneath his fingers, focused on the smell of grease, focused on the cold concrete beneath his boots. Montana. Not Afghanistan. Montana. The panic slowly retreated. Minutes later, he sat outside the garage, Shadow beside him. The dog leaned against his leg, silent, faithful, present. The way he always was. Thanks, buddy. Shadow rested his head on Jack's knee. No judgment. No questions. Just loyalty. The afternoon passed quietly after that. Jack returned to work. The Mustang slowly began revealing itself beneath decades of neglect, and all day long Shadow remained near the rear passenger area. Watching, waiting, studying, as if something hidden inside the car was calling to him. Near sunset, Jack packed up. Another day finished, another small step forward. The mountains glowed crimson beyond town. Long shadows stretched across Main Street. Everything seemed peaceful again. Until midnight. Jack woke suddenly. Not from a nightmare. From barking. Shadow. The dog stood near the cabin door, growling, not aggressively, urgently. Jack sat upright. "What is it?" Shadow barked again, then moved toward the window. The Mustang. Even in darkness, Jack knew. The dog was focused on the Mustang. Again. For several minutes, Shadow paced between the door and the window. Back and forth, as though trying desperately to communicate something. Jack finally stepped outside. Moonlight bathed the clearing. The Mustang sat silent beneath the stars. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet Shadow walked directly to the rear passenger side. His nose pressed against the body panel. Then he scratched. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed softly through the mountain night. Jack stared. The dog wasn't acting randomly. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was certainty. Shadow believed something was there. Something hidden. Something important. Jack knelt beside him. The dog immediately scratched again. The exact same spot. A chill crawled along the back of Jack's neck. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe the Mustang contained something neither of them understood yet. Something buried beneath rust. Something forgotten. Something waiting 20 years to be found. And Shadow seemed determined to uncover it, no matter how long it took. And Shadow seemed determined to uncover it, no matter how long it took. The next morning arrived under a blanket of gray clouds. A cold wind rolled down from the Bitterroot Mountains, rattling the pine branches surrounding Jack Mercer's cabin. The world felt muted, suspended between autumn and winter. Jack barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Shadow scratching at the same spot near the Mustang's rear passenger side. The behavior wasn't random. Years of working with military dogs had taught him that. Dogs noticed patterns people missed. They detected scents long forgotten. They sensed things buried beneath layers of time. And Shadow had never been wrong about something important. Not once. The old German Shepherd was already awake when Jack stepped onto the porch. He sat facing the Mustang, waiting, watching. The car stood motionless beneath a thin layer of frost. Jack poured coffee into a dented metal mug. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Shadow glanced back briefly, then returned his attention to the car. Jack chuckled. "Yeah, I figured." An hour later, they were back at the sawmill garage. The old building sat at the edge of Elk Ridge beside a narrow river lined with cottonwood trees. The rusty steel structure had once echoed with the sounds of lumber production. Now it mostly echoed with memories. Jack rolled up the garage door. Cold air swept inside. Dust floated through beams of pale sunlight. The Mustang waited exactly where they'd left it. Shadow immediately trotted over, straight to the rear passenger side. Again, same place, same focus, same determination. Jack crouched beside him. "What are you trying to tell me?" The dog scratched the carpet area visible through the open door. 3 quick scrapes. Then he looked directly at Jack. Waiting. Jack sighed. All right. He grabbed a flashlight and toolbox. Let's see what you've got. The interior smelled like old leather, mildew, and decades of neglect. He removed the remaining pieces of rear trim, unscrewed several rusted brackets, pulled away loose insulation. Nothing. Just old metal. Dust. Surface rust. Shadow whined, then scratched again. Harder this time. Jack leaned closer. His flashlight swept across the floor. For a moment he saw nothing. Then something caught his eye. A seam. Tiny. Almost invisible. Different from the surrounding metal. His pulse quickened. Well, he reached for a screwdriver, carefully worked it into the gap. The metal resisted, then suddenly shifted. A small hidden panel lifted upward. Both man and dog froze. For several seconds, neither moved. The compartment was no larger than a shoebox, hidden beneath the floor, completely invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Or had a dog-like shadow. Jack slowly reached inside. His fingers touched something cold. Metal. He pulled it out. A military dog tag. The chain rattled softly as it swung beneath the garage lights. Years of wear had dulled the metal surface, but the engraved letters remained visible. Jack stared. His stomach tightened. The name read, Tyler Holloway. The next line identified blood type and service number. Military. Definitely military. Shadow sat quietly beside him, watching. Jack swallowed hard. The discovery alone was enough to raise questions, but there was more. Much more. He reached inside again. This time he pulled out a faded photograph. The edges were worn, the colors nearly gone, yet the image remained clear enough. A young man stood beside the Mustang, 17 or 18 years old, athletic build, dark hair, easy smile. One hand rested proudly on the car's hood. Behind him stood an older man, probably his father. The two looked happy. The kind of happiness people rarely appreciate until it's gone. Jack studied the faces. Something about the photo felt important, personal, like he'd stumbled into somebody else's memories. Then he noticed one final item, folded paper, yellow with age, carefully preserved inside a weatherproof plastic sleeve. His heartbeat accelerated. The letter. The paper crackled softly as he unfolded it. Unfortunately, time had not been kind. Water damage had destroyed much of the writing. Entire sections were unreadable. Words faded into ghostly smudges. Only fragments survived. Jack carefully scanned the page. A few isolated sentences appeared. Nothing complete. Nothing that explained anything. Then his eyes stopped. One line remained perfectly clear, as though it had somehow survived when everything else disappeared. Jack read it aloud. If you're reading this... He paused. A strange chill crawled down his spine. Then he continued. I never made it home. Silence filled the garage. The mountains beyond the open door seemed suddenly distant. The river outside no longer made a sound. Even the wind felt still. Jack stared at the words, unable to look away. He knew those words, not literally, but emotionally. Every soldier knew them. Every deployed serviceman understood the possibility hiding behind that sentence. If you're reading this, I never made it home. The phrase carried weight, finality, sacrifice, loss. Jack had seen letters like it before. Some written before dangerous missions. Some stored away in case families received bad news. Others never delivered at all. The words reached into a place he usually kept locked. Memories surfaced. Faces. Voices. Men who should have grown old. Men who never got the chance. For a moment the garage disappeared. He saw desert sunlight. Dust. Helicopters. A teammate laughing over terrible coffee. Another teaching card tricks during downtime. A third promising he'd buy everyone steaks after deployment. Promises that never happened. Jack's jaw tightened. The old guilt returned. The familiar question. Why them? Why not me? A soft nudge against his arm interrupted the thought. Shadow. The dog pressed his nose against Jack's hand, grounding him, bringing him back. Jack exhaled slowly. Montana. Not Afghanistan. Montana. The photograph rested beside the letter. The dog tag glinted beneath the garage lights. 3 clues, 3 pieces of a story, and none of them explained why they had been hidden inside the Mustang. Yet. Shadow suddenly stood. His ears perked. The dog turned toward the garage entrance. Someone was approaching. A truck rolled into the gravel lot outside. An older Ford pickup, weathered, dust-covered. The vehicle stopped. Its engine died. For several moments, nobody emerged. Then the driver's door opened. An elderly man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered despite his age, wearing worn ranch boots and a faded canvas jacket. His face carried the weathered look of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. The man paused. His eyes landed on the Mustang, then on Jack, then on the items spread across the workbench, especially the photograph. Everything changed. The old man's expression froze. The color drained from his face. Jack immediately knew. This wasn't coincidence. The stranger took several slow steps forward. His gaze never left the photograph, or the dog tag. The air inside the garage seemed to grow heavier. Shadow moved beside Jack, alert but calm, watching, waiting. The old rancher stopped a few feet away. His eyes glistened, not quite tears, but close, very close. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the man's voice finally emerged. Quiet, unsteady, almost a whisper. Where? His throat tightened. He cleared it. Tried again. Where did you find those? Jack looked at the photograph, then at the hidden compartment, then back at the stranger. And suddenly he knew. The story hidden inside the Mustang was much bigger than he ever imagined, and it was about to walk through the garage door. The story hidden inside the Mustang was much bigger than he ever imagined, and it was about to walk through the garage door. The old rancher stood motionless beside the entrance. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight. The river outside whispered beyond the trees. Inside the garage, the silence felt heavy enough to touch. Jack glanced from the photograph to the elderly stranger. The man's eyes remained fixed on the image. Not curious, not surprised. Heartbroken. As if he were staring at a ghost, Shadow rose from beside the workbench. The German shepherd approached cautiously. Normally he was suspicious of strangers, especially men who appeared unexpectedly. But this time was different. The dog stopped a few feet from the rancher. His posture softened. His ears relaxed. Then, unexpectedly, Shadow sat down, watching him quietly. The old man noticed. His expression trembled. "You've got a good dog." Jack nodded. "The best." The rancher slowly stepped closer. His eyes moved to the dog tag, the name engraved on the metal. Tyler Holloway. His jaw tightened. The years seemed to settle across his shoulders all at once. Jack finally broke the silence. "You know him." It wasn't a question. The old man swallowed, then nodded. Yeah. His voice cracked. I know him. He stared at the photograph again. My son. The words hung in the air. Jack felt a chill move through him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The answer explained everything, and somehow raised even more questions. The rancher reached out carefully. His fingers hovered over the photograph, not touching it, just looking, as though afraid it might disappear. He was 17 there. Jack looked at the smiling young man in the picture. The resemblance was obvious now. Same eyes, same jawline, same stubborn expression. The old man took a slow breath. My name's Frank Holloway. Jack extended a hand. Jack Mercer. Frank shook it. His grip was firm despite his age. The grip of a man who had spent decades working cattle and fixing fences beneath Montana skies. Then his attention returned to the hidden compartment. You found these inside the Mustang? Jack nodded. This morning. Frank looked away, toward the mountains visible through the garage door. For a moment, his eyes seemed very far away, like he wasn't standing in Elk Ridge anymore, like he'd traveled backward through time. 20 years backward. Shadow quietly moved closer. The dog sat beside Frank's boots. The rancher looked down. His expression softened. My son loved dogs. Jack smiled slightly. Shadow usually doesn't make friends this fast. Frank scratched gently behind the dog's ear. Shadow accepted the attention without hesitation. Another strange thing. The dog seemed unusually comfortable around him, almost familiar. Jack couldn't explain it. Neither could Frank. Eventually, the old rancher straightened. His gaze settled on the Mustang, the rusted body, the faded paint, the years of neglect. A complicated mix of emotions crossed his face. Pride, pain, love, regret. I haven't seen her this close in 20 years. Jack glanced at the car. You owned it? Frank nodded, then corrected himself. No. A sad smile appeared. It belonged to Tyler. The smile disappeared almost immediately. The pain remained. Jack waited. Some stories needed room. Some grief needed silence before words. Frank finally walked toward the Mustang. His hand rested gently against the hood, the same way Jack had touched it inside the barn, the same way people touch something they once loved, something they lost. He bought this car when he was 17. His voice was quiet, steady, but every word carried weight. Worked all summer hauling hay and fixing fences. Frank laughed softly. Wouldn't spend a dime on himself. His eyes brightened briefly. Then one day he comes home with $6,000 and tells me we're buying a Mustang. Jack smiled despite himself. I can picture that. Oh, you should have seen him. Frank shook his head. He was obsessed. The old rancher slowly circled the car. His memories seemed to unfold with every step. We spent 2 years restoring it. His hand moved across the roof, every weekend, across the door, every evening after work, across the hood, every spare minute. The garage seemed quieter now. Even the river outside sounded distant. Jack listened, not because he was being polite, because he understood. The car wasn't transportation. The car was time. Father and son. Summer evenings. Shared dreams. The things people never realize they're creating until they're gone. Frank stopped beside the driver's door. He joined the army right after graduation. Jack nodded slowly. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The military dog tag, the unfinished letter, the hidden compartment, the soldier in the photograph. Everything connected. "What unit?" Jack asked. Frank looked down. His voice became softer. "Army Rangers." The answer hit harder than Jack expected. Elite, highly trained, the kind of men who volunteered for difficult missions, the kind of men who carried enormous burdens, the kind of men Jack respected. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jack asked the question hanging between them. "What happened?" Frank closed his eyes. Just for a second. When he opened them again, the pain was unmistakable. Afghanistan. The single word filled the room. No details, no explanations. None were necessary. Jack immediately understood. Every veteran understood. Sometimes one word carried an entire lifetime of grief. Frank stared at the Mustang. He never came home. The sentence barely rose above a whisper, yet it hit like a hammer. Jack felt his chest tighten. The old familiar ache returned. Different story, different battlefield. Same loss. Shadow slowly moved beside Frank. The dog pressed gently against his leg, offering comfort without understanding the reason. Or maybe understanding it perfectly. Frank placed a trembling hand on Shadow's head. For several seconds, he simply stood there, eyes closed, breathing slowly, trying to maintain control. When he finally spoke again, his voice was rough. "After they brought him home." He paused, swallowed, tried again. "After the funeral, I parked the Mustang behind my barn." Jack remained silent. Frank continued. "I couldn't touch it." The confession sounded painful, like something he'd carried alone for years. "I tried." His gaze stayed fixed on the car. "I really tried." A sad laugh escaped him. Every time I walked toward it, I saw him standing there. The old rancher's eyes glistened. I'd hear him talking. His voice cracked. I'd remember those summers. The silence returned, this time even heavier, because Jack understood exactly what Frank meant. Trauma wasn't always about remembering. Sometimes it was about being unable to forget. The Mustang had become a memorial, a monument to a life interrupted, a machine carrying too many memories. Frank eventually looked at Jack. "I sold it because I couldn't keep staring at the past." His eyes moved toward the hidden items on the workbench, then toward Shadow. The dog tag, the photograph, the damaged letter. "You finding those things?" He shook his head. "I never thought anyone would." Jack glanced at the hidden compartment. "You didn't know they were there?" Frank looked genuinely surprised. "No," the answer immediately changed everything. Jack frowned. "You never found the compartment?" Frank shook his head. "Never." The old rancher walked closer to the workbench. His attention settled on the partial letter. Carefully he picked it up, studied the surviving words. Then he froze. His breathing changed. Jack noticed immediately. "What is it?" Frank didn't answer right away. His eyes remained locked on the page. Finally he whispered, "That's his handwriting." The words sent another chill through the garage. Frank looked up. His face had gone pale. If Tyler hid this... He swallowed hard. There may be more. Jack stared at him. The hidden compartment. The military items. The unfinished letter, now this. The mystery had just grown larger. Much larger. Frank slowly folded the letter. His expression had changed. The grief remained. But something else had appeared. Determination. Hope. Maybe for the first time in years. He looked directly at Jack, then at Shadow, then back at the Mustang. I think it's time I told you the rest of the story. Outside, dark clouds gathered over the Bitterroot Mountains. The wind began rising across the valley. And inside the old garage, the next chapter of Tyler Holloway's life was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows. The wind began rising across the valley. And inside the old garage, the next chapter of Tyler Holloway's life was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows. Dark clouds rolled over the Bitterroot Mountains, swallowing patches of blue sky one ridge at a time. The distant peaks disappeared behind a curtain of gray as the weather shifted. But neither Jack nor Frank paid much attention. Their focus remained on the Mustang, and on the young man whose story seemed woven into every inch of steel. Frank pulled a chair from the corner of the garage and lowered himself onto it slowly. For several seconds, he simply stared at the photograph. His son, frozen forever at 17. Young, strong, certain the future belonged to him. Finally, he looked up. "I'll be back tomorrow." Jack frowned. "Back?" Frank nodded. "There's something you need to see." "What is it?" The old rancher managed a small smile. 20 years of memories. The next morning arrived cold and bright. The storm had passed during the night. Fresh snow dusted the highest peaks. Sunlight sparkled across the river beyond the sawmill. Jack arrived early. Shadow immediately trotted to the Mustang before anything else. The German Shepherd made another slow circle around the vehicle. His nose worked constantly, searching, studying, as though he still sensed unanswered questions hidden inside the car. Jack rubbed the dog's neck. "One mystery at a time, partner." An hour later, a pickup truck rolled into the gravel lot. Frank Holloway climbed out. The truck bed was loaded with boxes, not one or two, nearly a dozen. Cardboard containers worn by age, plastic storage bins, old military trunks, dust-covered photo albums. The past had arrived. Together, the two men carried everything inside. By the time they finished, half the garage looked like a family archive. Frank stood silently among the boxes. For a moment, he seemed uncertain, like a man about to reopen wounds he'd spent decades trying to close. Then Shadow walked over and gently rested his head against Frank's hand. The old rancher smiled sadly. "Guess we might as well start." The first box contained photographs, hundreds of them, years of memories stacked together. Jack spent hours looking through them. Tyler as a little boy riding fence lines with his father. Tyler holding his first fish beside a mountain lake. Tyler helping repair tractors. Tyler standing proudly beside the Mustang during various stages of restoration. The photographs told a story words couldn't. A father, a son, a friendship, a partnership, a life. One image in particular caught Jack's attention. Tyler sat cross-legged on the garage floor. Grease covered his face. A wrench hung from one hand. Behind him, Frank laughed at something outside the frame. The joy was unmistakable. Jack found himself smiling. Then, unexpectedly, the smile faded, because the image reminded him of someone, himself, years ago. Before deployments, before funerals, before PTSD, before everything changed. His own father had taught him mechanics. Saturday mornings spent rebuilding engines, long conversations beneath open hoods, lessons disguised as repair work. Jack hadn't thought about those memories in years. Not really. The realization hit harder than expected. Frank noticed. "You okay?" Jack stared at the photograph. "Yeah." A pause. Then, "My dad taught me this stuff too." Frank nodded slowly. The two men understood each other without needing additional explanation. Some bonds were built through words, others through tools. The second box contained notebooks, repair logs, maintenance records, handwritten notes, every stage of the Mustang's restoration carefully documented. Tyler had been meticulous. Dates, parts, paint ideas, engine modifications, future plans, dreams. Jack flipped through page after page. The handwriting remained consistent, confident, organized, determined. A young man building something that mattered. Shadow lay quietly beside the boxes. The dog watched everything, occasionally lifting his head whenever Tyler's name was mentioned, as if he recognized its importance. By afternoon, they reached the letters. Dozens of them. Some written during training, others sent home during deployment, most addressed to Frank. The old rancher hesitated before opening the first one. His hands trembled slightly. Jack understood. These weren't just letters. They were conversations interrupted by time. Frank unfolded one carefully. The paper crackled. Then he began reading aloud. "Hey, Dad. You'd laugh if you saw this place. Everything's dust, rocks, and more dust. Tell Rusty not to eat my boots while I'm gone." The old rancher stopped. A laugh escaped him unexpectedly. "Rusty was our old Labrador." Jack smiled. Frank continued. The letter was simple. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. Mostly stories, small observations, questions about home, thoughts about the Mustang, the kind of everyday conversation people rarely realize they'll miss someday. When the letter ended, neither man spoke. The garage felt quieter than before. Not sad, not exactly, just reflective. The next letter mentioned the Mustang again, then another, and another. Jack began noticing a pattern, no matter where Tyler was, no matter what was happening. He always asked about the car. The project never left his mind. One letter included an entire page of ideas. Future upgrades, paint concepts, performance improvements, dreams waiting for his return. Halfway through the stack, Frank opened a different envelope. The paper inside was thicker, more personal. His expression changed immediately. "What is it?" Jack asked. Frank stared silently for several seconds, then handed the letter over. Jack began reading. The words struck him almost immediately. This wasn't written to a father. This was written to himself. A private journal entry. A reflection. The final lines stopped him cold. "If something ever happens to me, don't let the Mustang sit and rust. Cars aren't supposed to die waiting. They're supposed to keep moving." Jack read the sentence twice, then a third time. The words lingered. Cars aren't supposed to die waiting. Neither are people. The thought surfaced unexpectedly, and once it appeared, he couldn't ignore it. Maybe that was why this story felt so personal. The Mustang wasn't just Tyler's unfinished dream. It was becoming a mirror, a reflection of everything Jack had stopped believing about himself. Frank quietly closed another box. "You know something?" Jack looked up. The old rancher smiled faintly. "I haven't talked about him this much in 20 years. Jack nodded. "I figured." Frank stared at the Mustang. "I spent so long trying not to think about him." His eyes glistened. "But now..." He looked toward the photograph, then the journals, then the letters. "It feels good." The confession surprised both men. Healing often arrived quietly, not with dramatic speeches, not with grand moments. Just two people sitting in a garage, remembering someone they loved. As evening settled outside, golden sunlight streamed through the dusty windows. The Mustang glowed softly beneath the fading light. Shadow rose and walked toward the car. He stopped beside the passenger door. The same place, the same focus. Again. Jack noticed immediately. The dog wasn't finished, not even close. Shadow lowered his nose toward the vehicle, then looked directly at Jack. A long stare. Intentional. Certain. As though saying, "There's still more." The hidden compartment had revealed a story, but not the whole story. Not yet. And somewhere inside the Mustang, another secret was still waiting to be found. Not yet. And somewhere inside the Mustang, another secret was still waiting to be found. The feeling stayed with Jack all the way home. The mountains surrounding Elk Ridge seemed different that evening. Darker. Heavier. As if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. Shadow sat quietly in the passenger seat during the drive back to the cabin. Usually, the aging German shepherd would rest his head against the window or drift into a light sleep. Not tonight. Tonight, he remained alert. Watching. Thinking. Waiting. Jack glanced at him several times. "You know something I don't you?" Shadow's ears twitched. The dog never looked away from the road ahead. The sun disappeared behind on the Bitterroot Mountains shortly after they arrived. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped sharply. A storm was moving in. Jack could feel it in his bones. The wind came first. Long, mournful gusts swept through the pines surrounding the cabin. Tree branches groaned. Loose boards rattled. Clouds swallowed the moon. Then came the snow. At first it drifted gently through the darkness. By midnight it was coming sideways. The mountains vanished behind a wall of white. Inside the cabin, the wood stove glowed orange. The fire crackled softly. Shadow lay near the door. Jack sat at the small table, staring at Tyler Holloway's photograph. The young ranger smiled back at him from another lifetime. Jack couldn't stop thinking about the letters, the journals, the hidden compartment, the unfinished story. Who had Tyler become? What dreams had he carried into Afghanistan? What had he hidden inside that Mustang? A sudden blast of wind slammed against the cabin. The walls shuddered. The photograph trembled on the table. Jack looked toward the window. Snow covered everything. The world outside had disappeared. The storm had fully arrived. He eventually climbed into bed. Sleep came reluctantly. When it finally arrived, it brought the usual demons. Dark valleys, explosions, radio chatter, a teammate calling for help. Then the sound that always returned. Artillery, thunder, chaos. The nightmare deepened. The battlefield stretched endlessly around him. Dust filled the air. Men shouted. Vehicles burned. Jack turned and saw movement through the smoke. One of his teammates, Corporal Ryan Ellis, 26 years old, newly married. A man who should have lived another 50 years. Ryan looked directly at him, then vanished into the dust. Jack tried to reach him, tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. The sound grew louder. Closer. 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 Boom! Jack's eyes flew open. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Another explosion shook the darkness. Boom! Not an explosion. Thunder. The storm. Montana. Not Afghanistan. But his body didn't know the difference. Adrenaline flooded his system. His heart hammered violently. The cabin seemed to spin. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains again. The sound echoed through the valley. For Jack's traumatized mind, it became something else entirely. Incoming fire. Danger. Death. The years vanished. The therapy vanished. The mountains vanished. Suddenly, he was back there. Back in the war. His breathing accelerated. His vision narrowed. His hands trembled. Another flash illuminated the cabin windows. Shadow immediately sprang to his feet. The German shepherd recognized the signs. He had seen them before. The panic, the disorientation, the fear. Jack staggered toward the door. His thoughts were no longer rational. Part of him believed he needed to move, needed to escape, needed to find cover. His hand reached for the handle. The storm howled outside. The temperature had dropped well below freezing. If he wandered into those mountains tonight in this condition, he might never come back. Shadow barked sharply. Once, twice, 3 times. Jack didn't respond. The dog moved instantly, planting himself directly between Jack and the door. Jack tried stepping around him. Shadow blocked him again. Another bark, louder this time, more urgent. Jack's breathing remained ragged. The room blurred. His hands shook violently. Then Shadow jumped forward, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough. The dog shoved his head beneath Jack's hand, forcing contact, forcing connection, forcing him back into the present. Jack froze. Shadow pressed closer. The familiar feel of thick fur grounded him. The warmth, the smell, the weight. Reality slowly returned. Montana, not Afghanistan. Cabin, not battlefield. Shadow, not combat. Jack dropped to one knee. His chest heaved. The dog immediately leaned against him. Steady, solid, present. The thunder continued outside, but it no longer sounded like artillery. Now it was simply weather. A storm moving through the mountains. Nothing more, nothing less. Several minutes passed before Jack could finally speak. "Good boy." His voice cracked. Shadow licked his hand. Jack wrapped both arms around the dog. For a long moment, neither moved. The storm raged outside. Inside, the battle slowly ended. Eventually, Jack stood, exhausted, drained, but present. Then something changed. Shadow's posture shifted. His ears rose. His attention moved away from Jack, toward the window, toward the Mustang. The dog suddenly became alert again. The same alertness he'd shown for days. Then he barked. Not at the storm, at the car. Jack frowned. "Not now, buddy." Shadow barked again, then ran to the door. Back to the window. Back to the door. The pattern repeated. Urgent, focused, intentional. Jack stared. Even after everything that had happened, the dog remained obsessed with the Mustang. The realization sent a chill through him. Whatever Shadow sensed, it mattered. The storm continued hammering the mountains. Snow piled against the cabin. Wind screamed through the trees, yet Shadow refused to stop. Finally, Jack grabbed his coat. "You've got to be kidding me." The moment he opened the door, freezing air exploded inside. Snow swirled across the porch. Visibility was terrible. The Mustang sat beneath a tarp near the shed, barely visible through the storm. Shadow raced toward it. Jack followed. The dog reached the rear of the vehicle, then jumped into the open trunk area where restoration work had exposed sections of metal. Immediately, Shadow began scratching. Not the passenger compartment this time. The trunk. Specifically, the right rear corner. Again, and again, and again. Jack shined his flashlight. Snow whipped through the beam. The dog continued digging. His claws scraped against metal. Then suddenly, clang. A different sound. Both man and dog froze. Jack lowered the flashlight. Something beneath the metal floor sounded hollow. Very hollow. His pulse quickened. Shadow barked once, then scratched the exact same spot. Jack knelt despite the snow. The flashlight revealed something hidden beneath decades of grime. A narrow seam, almost invisible, almost impossible to notice. Another compartment, a second compartment, larger than the first, hidden deep inside the trunk. Jack stared. The storm roared around them. Thunder echoed across the mountains. Snow covered his shoulders. But none of it mattered, because Shadow had done it again. The old dog turned toward him, tail moving slowly, eyes bright, certain, the same look he'd worn from the beginning. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ears. A smile finally appeared, the first genuine smile in days. "You found it." Shadow wagged his tail. Jack looked back at the hidden seam, the second secret, the bigger secret. Whatever Tyler Holloway had hidden all those years ago was waiting on the other side. And by morning, everything was about to change. And by morning, everything was about to change. The storm finally loosened its grip just before sunrise. Fresh snow covered the mountains like a white blanket stretching to the horizon. Pine trees bowed beneath the weight of ice. The world outside Jack Mercer's cabin looked untouched, silent, almost sacred. Inside, neither Jack nor Shadow had slept much. The hidden compartment in the Mustang's trunk sat in Jack's mind all night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the narrow seam beneath the metal floor. Every time he looked at Shadow, the old German shepherd seemed to be waiting for the next step. As soon as daylight arrived, they headed back to the sawmill garage. The roads were slick. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs. But Jack barely noticed. His thoughts remained fixed on the Mustang. The garage felt colder than usual when he rolled the door open. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, illuminating floating dust particles like tiny stars. The Mustang waited in the center of the building, silent, patient, holding on to secrets for more than 20 years. Shadow immediately trotted toward the trunk. His tail wagged once, then he sat beside the hidden compartment, waiting. Jack smiled. "Yeah, buddy. Let's find out." A few minutes later, Frank Holloway arrived. The old rancher stepped out of his truck carrying coffee. One look at Jack's face told him something had happened. "You found something else." It wasn't a question. Jack nodded. Frank set down the coffee. Neither man spoke for a moment. The anticipation was almost painful. Together, they moved to the rear of the Mustang. Jack removed the temporary panel he'd loosened during the storm. The hidden compartment became visible. Frank stared at it. "I never knew." His voice barely rose above a whisper. Neither did Tyler's mother. His eyes remained fixed on the opening. "All these years." Jack carefully reached inside. His fingers brushed against a metal container. Slowly, he pulled it free. The box was military green, weathered, scratched, but still intact. The kind of container designed to survive harsh conditions. Both men stared at it. Shadow sat quietly beside them, watching, almost as if he understood how important this moment was. Jack unlatched the lid. The hinges creaked softly. Inside were 3 items. Nothing more, nothing less. A brass key, a sealed envelope, and a flash drive. The garage fell silent. Frank picked up the key first. It was old, solid brass. A small tag remained attached. The writing had faded beyond recognition. "I've never seen this before," Frank said. Jack nodded. His attention moved to the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Carefully, he opened it. Something slid into his hand. A cashier's check. Frank frowned. "What is that?" Jack looked closer, then froze. The amount nearly made him drop it. $22,000. The check had never been cashed, never deposited, never touched. Frank stared. His face went pale. I remember that. Jack looked up. The old rancher's eyes had become distant. He saved for years. Frank swallowed hard. Extra jobs, ranch work, construction, whatever he could find. His voice grew softer. He said it was for the Mustang. The realization hit both men simultaneously. Tyler had hidden the money before deployment, then never returned. The check had sat inside the car for 2 decades, waiting. Frank slowly lowered himself into a chair. His hands trembled. 20 years. The words sounded unreal. 20 years. Jack placed the check carefully back into the envelope. But the biggest mystery remained. The flash drive. Shadow suddenly stood. His ears lifted. The dog stared directly at the small device, then looked at Jack. The message was clear. Keep going. Jack retrieved an old laptop from his workbench. The machine took several minutes to boot. Neither man spoke while they waited. The tension inside the garage grew heavier with every second. Finally, the screen came alive. Jack inserted the flash drive. Several files appeared. Videos, dozens of them, each dated shortly before Tyler's final deployment. Frank's breath caught. Jack clicked the first file. The screen flickered. Then a young man appeared. Tyler Holloway. Alive. Moving. Smiling. Not frozen in a photograph. Not trapped inside memories. Alive. Frank immediately covered his mouth. The years seemed to collapse around him. For the first time in 2 decades, he was seeing his son's face move, hearing his voice. Tyler laughed at something off camera. Okay, if this thing's recording, we're good. His smile was familiar. The same smile from the photograph. The same eyes. The same confidence. Frank's shoulders began shaking. Tears rolled down his weathered face. Jack quietly looked away, giving him privacy. The first videos were simple. Tyler working on the Mustang, talking about future plans, joking about how long restoration projects always take, speaking about home, about Montana, about his father, about life. Then came the final file, the longest one. The date was only days before deployment. Tyler sat alone in front of the camera. No smile this time, no jokes, just honesty. The garage became completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear. Tyler looked directly into the lens. If you're watching this... He paused, took a breath. Then things probably didn't go the way I hoped. Frank closed his eyes. Jack felt his chest tighten. Tyler continued. I don't know who found this. A faint smile appeared. But if you're sitting in front of this screen, it means you found the Mustang. His eyes softened. And that means you care enough to keep looking. The words landed heavily, because that was exactly what had happened. Shadow had kept looking. Jack had kept looking, and now they were here. Tyler glanced down briefly, then back at the camera. First thing. His voice grew quieter. If my dad's still around. Frank's head dropped. Please look after him. The old rancher broke. Years of grief flooded out all at once. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder. Neither man spoke. The video continued. My dad spent more time helping me build this car than he ever spent helping himself. Tyler smiled sadly. He'll never tell you that. A tear rolled down Frank's cheek, but he deserves peace. The screen flickered slightly. Then Tyler added one final thought. the words that would change everything. Cars can be rebuilt. He looked straight into the camera. So can people. The sentence hung in the air. Powerful. Simple. True. Tyler smiled one last time. If you're finishing the Mustang, he nodded slowly. Make it count. The video ended. The screen went black. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For several long minutes, the only sound came from the river outside the garage. Shadow quietly walked over to Frank. The old German shepherd rested his head on the rancher's knee. Frank buried a trembling hand in the dog's fur. The gesture seemed to steady him. Jack stared at the dark laptop screen. The hidden compartment had revealed more than money, more than clues, more than a mystery. It had delivered a voice from the past, a message that had survived 20 years, a message meant for whoever came next. And for the first time since buying the Mustang, Jack realized something. This was no longer a restoration project. It had become a mission. And somehow, it felt like Tyler Holloway had just given him his orders. It had become a mission. And somehow, it felt like Tyler Holloway had just given him his orders. The days that followed felt different. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just different. The old sawmill garage no longer felt like a place where Jack Mercer repaired machines. It felt like a place where something unfinished was slowly being brought back to life. Outside, winter tightened its grip on the Bitterroot Mountains. Snow covered the valleys. Ice formed along the edges of the river. The small town of Elk Ridge settled into its cold weather rhythm. But inside the garage, a quiet transformation had begun. Every morning, Jack and Shadow arrived before sunrise. The German shepherd had developed a routine of his own. He inspected the Mustang first. Always. Then he made a slow lap around the building before settling near the workbench. Watching. Guarding. Listening. Almost as if he understood the importance of what they were doing. Jack spent hours studying Tyler's flash drive. There were dozens of files, videos, scanned sketches, notes, ideas, dreams. The deeper he explored them, the more real Tyler became. Not a photograph, not a memory, a person. A young man with plans, ambitions, humor, fear, hope. Someone who had expected to come home. One afternoon, Jack sat alone watching another recording. Shadow slept beside the workbench. The screen showed Tyler standing beside the Mustang years earlier. The young ranger pointed at the unfinished engine. If Dad sees this video, tell him he's still wrong about carburetors. He laughed, then shook his head. I swear that man would argue with a brick wall. The video ended. Jack found himself smiling. Then something unexpected happened. The smile disappeared, because he suddenly realized he hadn't smiled that naturally in a very long time. Not since before the nightmares became routine. Not since before the guilt settled permanently into his chest. The realization stayed with him. Later that evening, Frank arrived carrying 2 thermoses of coffee. The old rancher had started visiting almost every day. At first it was to answer questions, then to share stories. Now it seemed neither man needed an excuse. They sat in folding chairs beside the Mustang. Steam rose from their coffee cups. Snow drifted past the garage windows. For a while neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar. The kind shared by people who understood loss. Eventually, Frank broke it. You served how long? Jack stared into his coffee. 12 years. Frank nodded. Navy SEAL, yeah? The old rancher studied him. You don't talk about it much. Jack laughed softly. No. The answer hung there. Frank waited. Patient. Jack appreciated that. Too many people pushed. Frank never did. Several minutes passed before Jack spoke again. Lost some good men. Frank nodded slowly. The simple statement carried enormous weight. He understood. More than most. The old rancher stared at the Mustang. I used to think losing Tyler was the hardest thing a person could survive. Jack remained silent. Frank continued. Then I met other Gold Star families. His eyes grew distant. Met mothers, wives, brothers, children. The old rancher shook his head. There are too many empty chairs in this country. The words settled heavily between them. Outside, the wind brushed against the building. Inside, neither man looked away from the Mustang. Jack finally spoke. The mission wasn't supposed to go bad. Frank turned toward him. For the first time, Jack wasn't talking about Tyler. He was talking about himself. About the thing he rarely discussed. The thing he carried everywhere. The thing that haunted him. Jack stared at the concrete floor. We'd done operations like it before. His voice remained calm, almost detached. The way veterans often spoke about painful memories. The intel looked solid. A pause. Everything looked solid. Frank listened quietly. Jack's eyes drifted toward the falling snow outside. But he wasn't seeing Montana anymore. He was somewhere else. Years earlier. A different world. A different life. We lost 3 guys. The words emerged softly. No drama, no theatrics. Just truth. Frank lowered his gaze. Jack continued. They had families. A pause. Plans. Another pause. Future birthdays. His jaw tightened. They should have come home. The old rancher said nothing. Sometimes silence was the greatest form of respect. Jack exhaled slowly. The worst part isn't the memories. Frank looked at him. What is? Jack stared toward Shadow. The dog had awakened, quietly watching from across the garage. The worst part is waking up every morning wondering why you're the one who made it. The confession lingered. Raw, honest, painfully familiar. Frank nodded. Very slowly. I know that feeling. Jack looked up. The old rancher's eyes glistened. I spent years asking why Tyler and not me. His voice cracked. Would have traded places in a heartbeat. Neither man spoke after that. They didn't need to. 2 different wars. 2 different losses. The same wound. The same question. The same grief. Shadow eventually stood and crossed the garage. The old dog stopped between them, then lowered himself onto the floor, perfectly positioned between Jack and Frank. The gesture made both men smile. He always does that, Jack said. What? Finds the people who need company, Frank chuckled quietly. Smart dog. The days passed, and something subtle began changing. The Mustang continued to improve. Rust disappeared. Parts were cleaned. Components were rebuilt. But that wasn't the real transformation. The real transformation was happening inside the garage itself, inside the conversations, inside the silence, inside the memories finally being shared. One Saturday morning, a local mechanic named Pete stopped by, then another veteran, then the retired sheriff. Soon people began appearing simply to help. Not because they loved Mustangs, because they loved stories, because they understood what the car represented, because Tyler's dream had become something larger than a restoration. It had become a symbol, a reminder, a promise. One evening, long after everyone left, Jack remained alone in the garage. The mountains outside had turned purple beneath the setting sun. Golden light spilled through the windows. The Mustang sat partially restored beneath that glow. Shadow slept beside it. Jack studied Tyler's photograph, then looked at the car, then at the dog. A thought surfaced unexpectedly. Maybe Tyler's message hadn't only been meant for his father. Maybe it had been meant for people like Jack. People who survived. People carrying guilt. People convinced they were broken beyond repair. Cars can be rebuilt. So can people. The words echoed inside his mind. Again. And again. And again. For the first time in years, the possibility didn't feel impossible. Healing. Real healing. Not forgetting. Not erasing. But carrying the weight differently. The realization frightened him. Hope often did. Because hope required vulnerability. Hope required believing tomorrow might be better than today. And Jack Mercer had spent a long time avoiding that belief. Outside, the last light faded behind the mountains. Inside, Shadow lifted his head. The old German shepherd looked at Jack, tail thumping once against the floor. Jack smiled. A real smile. Small, but genuine. Maybe you're right, buddy. Shadow's tail thumped again. The garage settled into comfortable silence. The kind of silence that follows understanding. The kind that follows honesty. The kind that follows healing. Neither man knew it yet. But beyond the mountains, another storm was already gathering. And this time it wouldn't come from the sky. But beyond the mountains, another storm was already gathering. And this time it wouldn't come from the sky. Winter settled over Elk Ridge like a thick blanket. Snow lined the rooftops. Smoke drifted from chimneys. The river moved slower beneath patches of ice. Life continued as it always had in the small Montana town. But the story of the Mustang had begun spreading far beyond the valley. It started with a photograph. Pete, the local mechanic, posted a picture online showing Jack standing beside the partially restored Mustang. The caption was simple. Former Navy SEAL restoring fallen Ranger's dream. Nobody expected much. Yet somehow the story resonated. People shared it. Veterans shared it. Military families shared it. Classic car enthusiasts shared it. Within weeks, thousands of people had seen Tyler Holloway's Mustang. The attention made Jack uncomfortable. He wasn't interested in recognition. He wasn't building the car for praise. He was finishing a promise. Still, the attention brought visitors. Some came to see the Mustang. Others came to hear Tyler's story. A few simply wanted to shake Jack's hand. One afternoon, a local reporter interviewed Frank beside the car. The old rancher spoke quietly, honestly, without embellishment. When the story aired on regional television, something changed. The Mustang was no longer just a local project. It had become a symbol. And symbols attracted attention. Not all of it good. The first sign appeared on a Thursday morning. A black luxury SUV rolled into the sawmill parking lot. It looked completely out of place among the pickups and work trucks usually parked there. The vehicle gleamed despite the winter roads. Its driver stepped out wearing an expensive overcoat, polished shoes, perfect haircut, perfect smile. Everything about him felt manufactured. Shadow noticed immediately. The German shepherd had been sleeping near the garage door. The moment the man exited the SUV, Shadow stood. His posture stiffened. His ears rose. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Jack noticed. Shadow rarely reacted that way, especially before meeting someone. The stranger entered the garage. His smile widened. "You must be Jack Mercer." Jack wiped grease from his hands. "Depends who's asking." The man laughed. Confident. Practiced. "My name is Victor Kane." He extended a hand. Jack shook it, briefly. Victor's eyes immediately moved toward the Mustang. The smile remained, but something about it felt wrong. Like he wasn't looking at a dream. He was looking at an opportunity. Beautiful project. Jack nodded. Getting there. Victor slowly walked around the car, studying every angle, every detail, every improvement, like an appraiser inspecting a valuable asset. Shadow followed him, every step, never taking his eyes off him. Victor eventually stopped beside the driver's side door. I've heard quite a lot about this Mustang. Jack remained silent. The man continued. The story is remarkable. Tyler Holloway, the hidden compartment, the military connection, the videos. He smiled again. A powerful narrative. Something about the phrase bothered Jack. Narrative, not legacy, not sacrifice. Narrative, like Tyler's life was a marketing campaign. Victor reached into his coat, pulled out a business card. Perhaps we should talk. Jack glanced at the card. Kane Development Group. The name meant nothing to him. Victor noticed. I own several properties throughout western Montana. Frank happened to arrive at that exact moment. The old rancher stepped inside carrying coffee. The second he saw Victor, his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for Jack to notice. Victor smiled. Frank Holloway. The rancher didn't smile back. Victor. The tension was immediate, subtle, but undeniable. Jack looked between them. You know each other? Frank's jaw tightened. A little. Victor ignored the tone. His attention returned to the Mustang. Then came the offer. I'd like to buy it. Jack laughed. Not because it was funny, because he genuinely thought Victor was joking. The man wasn't. I'm serious. Jack shook his head. Not for sale. Victor smiled calmly. Everything has a price. Shadow growled. The sound echoed through the garage. Victor looked down. The German shepherd stood beside Jack now, watching him carefully. Victor's smile faded slightly. He doesn't seem to like me. No, Jack said. He doesn't. For the first time, Victor looked uncomfortable, only briefly. Then the polished confidence returned. I'm prepared to make a very generous offer. Jack crossed his arms. Still not for sale. Victor glanced toward Frank, then back to Jack. I think you should hear the number first. Jack didn't move. Victor named an amount. The figure was substantial. Far more money than Jack had seen in years. Enough to change his circumstances overnight. Enough to erase debt. Enough to buy a home. Enough to make most people hesitate. Jack didn't. No. Victor blinked. Perhaps he wasn't accustomed to hearing that word. The silence stretched. Then Victor smiled again. This time the smile looked colder. Interesting. He slipped the card onto a workbench. If you change your mind. Jack didn't touch it. Victor eventually left. The SUV disappeared down the snowy road. Only after it vanished did Shadow finally relax. Frank stared after the vehicle, his expression troubled. Jack noticed immediately. What was that about? The old rancher sighed. Long, heavy, complicated. Victor Kane owns land all over this county. Jack waited. Frank continued. Developments, resorts, vacation properties. The old rancher's voice grew harder. He tried buying part of my ranch 3 years ago. Jack frowned. What for? Frank looked toward the mountains, toward a distant stretch of valley hidden beneath snow. Tyler had plans for a section of that land. Jack's attention sharpened. What kind of plans? The old rancher smiled sadly. The same kind of plans veterans always seem to have. A pause. He wanted to build a retreat. Jack stared. A retreat? Frank nodded. For veterans. The words hung in the air. He said some people come home carrying too much. The old rancher's eyes drifted toward Jack. He wanted a place where they could breathe again. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Victor wanted the land. Tyler had wanted to help veterans on it. Two completely different visions. Two completely different futures. That evening, as darkness settled over Elk Ridge, Shadow became restless. More restless than usual. The dog repeatedly checked the garage doors, the windows, the parking lot. Every shadow seemed to hold his attention. Jack noticed. The behavior reminded him of military patrol dogs. Alert, focused, watching for threats. Around midnight, while finishing paperwork inside the office, Jack heard barking. Sharp, urgent, different. He rushed outside. Shadow stood near the back of the building, growling toward the tree line. The dog barked again. Jack scanned the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then movement. A figure. Someone disappearing into the woods behind the garage. Too far away to identify. Gone within seconds. Jack frowned. Probably a trespasser. Maybe a curious local. Maybe not. Shadow remained tense long after the figure vanished. The next morning, Jack discovered fresh footprints behind the building. Not animal tracks. Human. Someone had been watching. The realization settled heavily in his chest. And suddenly, Victor Kane's visit felt far less innocent. For the first time since finding Tyler's hidden secrets, Jack felt something new entering the story. Not grief, not healing, not mystery. Conflict. And Shadow seemed to sense it before anyone else. Because from that day forward, the old German Shepherd never left the Mustang alone. And Shadow seemed to sense it before anyone else. Because from that day forward, the old German Shepherd never left the Mustang alone. The change was impossible to miss. Before Victor Kane's visit, Shadow had treated the Mustang like a mystery. Afterward, he treated it like something that needed protection. Every morning he inspected the garage. Every evening he checked the doors. Whenever a stranger approached, his attention sharpened immediately. Jack trusted that instinct. Military dogs survived by noticing danger before humans did, and Shadow had spent years proving his instincts were rarely wrong. Winter deepened around Elk Ridge. The Mustang continued its transformation. Fresh parts arrived. Rusted sections disappeared. The engine slowly came back to life. For the first time in decades, the car looked less like a forgotten relic and more like a dream being restored. People continued stopping by. Veterans, mechanics, neighbors. Some brought tools, others brought stories. A few simply brought coffee. The garage had become something unexpected. A gathering place. A place where people shared memories. Where grief felt lighter. Where healing felt possible. But beneath that warmth, tension continued growing. Twice more, Shadow caught strangers lingering near the property after dark. Both times the figures disappeared before Jack could reach them. Both times the dog reacted long before anyone else noticed. The incidents unsettled him. Not because he felt afraid, because they felt deliberate. Someone was watching. The realization became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Frank arrived looking troubled. The old rancher removed his gloves and sat heavily in a chair. Jack immediately noticed. What's wrong? Frank stared at the floor. Victor came by the ranch. Jack's expression hardened. What did he want? The same thing he always wants. Frank looked toward the Mustang. Land. The old rancher sighed. He offered more money. Jack shook his head. And? Frank laughed humorlessly. I told him no. The answer didn't surprise either man. Victor Kane wasn't interested in Tyler's legacy. He was interested in profit. The difference mattered. Shadow lifted his head from beside the workbench. The dog watched Frank carefully, as if sensing the conversation's importance. Frank smiled faintly. Your dog knows when bad news walks into a room. Jack looked down at Shadow. Yeah. A pause. He usually does. The days continued. Work progressed. The Mustang's midnight blue paint, chosen from Tyler's design notes, had finally arrived. The color was breathtaking, deep, rich, almost black in the shadows, brilliant beneath sunlight. Even Frank became emotional seeing it. It looks exactly how he described it. His voice cracked slightly. For a moment, hope felt stronger than fear. For a moment, everything seemed possible. Then came Friday night. The town had settled beneath fresh snowfall. The streets were quiet. The mountains stood beneath a sky filled with stars. Jack stayed late at the garage finishing bodywork. Around 10 o'clock, he finally packed his tools. The Mustang sat beneath bright shop lights, nearly complete. Months of effort reflected across every polished surface. Shadow rested beside the driver's door, half asleep, content. Jack locked the office, checked the building, then headed toward the exit. Halfway across the garage, his phone rang. It was Warren Pike, the retired mechanic who owned the property. A water pipe had burst at another building nearby. He needed help immediately. Jack hesitated. The garage was secure. The Mustang was safe. At least it seemed safe. Come on, buddy. Shadow rose slowly. The dog followed him outside. Neither realized someone was watching from the darkness. Nearly 2 hours passed. The emergency repair took longer than expected. By the time Jack returned, midnight had come and gone. Snow drifted across the empty streets. The sawmill sat alone at the edge of town. Something felt wrong immediately. Jack couldn't explain it. The building looked normal. The lights were off. The doors appeared closed. Yet Shadow suddenly froze. Every muscle in the dog's body tightened. Then came the growl. Low, dangerous, focused. Jack's pulse quickened. The front lock had been damaged, not destroyed. Tampered with. The realization hit instantly. Someone had entered the garage. Shadow exploded into motion. The German Shepherd raced toward the building. Jack followed. The front door stood slightly open. Cold air spilled from inside. Jack pushed through. Darkness. Silence. Then movement. A flashlight beam flashed briefly across the Mustang. Someone was inside. Several figures. Shadows moving through the garage. Jack shouted. The figures turned. For a split second, everything froze. Then chaos erupted. The intruders bolted toward a side exit. Shadow launched forward. Fast. Far faster than a dog his age should have been. The German Shepherd placed himself directly between the fleeing men and the Mustang, protecting the car, protecting Tyler's legacy, protecting the mission. One figure stumbled backward. Another changed direction. The entire plan collapsed. Jack reached the Mustang just as the intruders disappeared into the night. The confrontation lasted only moments, yet the damage was done. The garage fell silent again. Too silent. Then Jack heard it. A whimper. His heart stopped. Shadow? No response. Shadow! The flashlight beam swept across the floor, then found him. The old German shepherd lay near the Mustang, breathing, but struggling. Jack dropped to his knees instantly. His chest tightened. The world narrowed. Nothing existed except the dog. Nothing. Shadow lifted his head slightly. His tail moved once. Just once, trying to reassure him. Even now, even here. Jack's hands trembled. Stay with me. The words came out broken, raw, terrified. He had faced combat, loss, trauma, years of hardship. None of it prepared him for this. Because Shadow wasn't a pet. He was family, his partner, his anchor, the one constant presence through the darkest years of his life. Frank arrived minutes later. Then Pete. Then Warren. The entire garage community seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Everyone understood. Nobody needed explanations. They helped Jack load Shadow into the truck. The drive to the veterinary clinic felt endless. Snow blurred past the windshield. The mountains disappeared into darkness. Jack never took his hand off the dog. Not once. Shadow remained conscious, but barely. The clinic lights appeared just before 1 in the morning. Veterinarians rushed outside, took over immediately. Jack followed until they stopped him at the treatment room doors. Then all he could do was wait. The waiting was worse than anything. Hours passed. Frank sat beside him, silent, present, the same way Jack had sat beside him after Tyler's videos. Neither man spoke much. They didn't need to. Around 4 in the morning, the veterinarian finally appeared. The expression on her face revealed nothing. Jack stood instantly. His pulse hammered. The next words would determine everything. And for the first time in years, the former Navy SEAL felt completely helpless. Because some battles couldn't be fought with strength, only hope. Because some battles couldn't be fought with strength, only hope. The veterinarian removed her glasses and offered a tired smile. It was the smallest smile Jack Mercer had ever been grateful to see. He's stable. The words hit him harder than any explosion ever could. Jack closed his eyes. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing, trying to absorb what he had just heard. Frank Holloway exhaled beside him. The old rancher lowered his head and quietly whispered a thank you to nobody in particular. The veterinarian continued. He's going to need time. Jack nodded immediately. Whatever he needs. There are injuries, but he's a tough dog. A faint smile appeared on her face. I don't think he got the message that he's supposed to act his age. For the first time in days, Jack laughed. It came out rough and tired. But it was real. That sounds like Shadow. The next several weeks moved slowly. Winter loosened its grip on Elk Ridge one day at a time. Snowbanks shrank. The river began flowing stronger. The mountains traded white peaks for streaks of green. And every afternoon, Jack visited the veterinary clinic. No exceptions. Some days, Shadow slept through the visit. Other days, the old German shepherd managed to lift his head. Each small improvement felt like a victory. Each tail wag felt like a miracle. By early spring, Shadow was finally allowed to return home. The entire town seemed to celebrate. Pete from the repair shop brought steaks. Martha from the diner baked a pie. Even the retired sheriff stopped by with a bag of dog treats. The old sawmill garage welcomed its guardian back. Shadow moved slower than before. His muzzle looked even grayer, but his eyes remained bright, determined, present. The moment he entered the garage, he walked directly to the Mustang. Jack watched him carefully. The dog sniffed the driver's door, the front fender, the rear quarter panel, then settled beside the car with a satisfied sigh, like a soldier returning to his post. Good to have you back, partner. Shadow thumped his tail against the floor. The attack had changed something in Jack. Before, he had been restoring the Mustang because it mattered. Now he was restoring it because it had nearly cost him the one family member he had left. The project became personal in an entirely different way. Every evening after work, he stayed late. Every weekend, volunteers appeared. Word had spread far beyond Elk Ridge. Veterans traveled from neighboring counties to help. A retired machinist rebuilt custom parts. A former Air Force mechanic helped tune the engine. Young students came simply to watch and learn. The garage became a community, a brotherhood. Exactly the kind of place Tyler Holloway would have loved. One afternoon, Frank arrived carrying a weathered notebook. His expression was different, lighter somehow, less burdened. Found something. Jack looked up from the engine bay. What is it? Frank handed him the notebook. The cover read, Project Midnight. Jack opened it carefully. Inside were Tyler's final design sketches, paint notes, performance goals, interior plans, every detail meticulously recorded. One page contained a handwritten sentence. Simple, direct, pure Tyler. When she's finished, I want people to look at her and feel hope. Jack stared at the words. Hope. Not speed, not prestige, not attention. Hope. The realization stayed with him. Months passed. The Mustang slowly transformed. The bodywork was flawless. The engine purred. The interior gleamed, and the midnight blue paint looked almost magical beneath sunlight. It was exactly as Tyler had imagined. Perhaps even better. Finally, the day arrived. The day everyone had been working toward. The completion. The town organized a gathering at the Veterans Memorial overlooking Hollow Lake. The location sat on a hill above the water. Mountains surrounded the shoreline. Pine forests stretched across the horizon. American flags moved gently in the spring breeze. By noon, hundreds of people had gathered. Veterans, families, neighbors, students, mechanics, people who had followed the story from the beginning, others who had only recently heard it. Everyone waited. The Mustang sat beneath a large cover near the memorial stage. Sunlight reflected off the lake. Birds drifted across the water. The entire scene felt cinematic, almost unreal. Jack stood beside Shadow. The old German Shepherd wore a new service vest donated by local veterans. His posture remained proud despite his age. Frank approached them. For several moments, none of them spoke. The old rancher simply looked out across the crowd, then toward the covered Mustang, then toward the mountains. I wish he could see this. Jack nodded. So do I. Frank smiled sadly. Maybe he can. The ceremony began. Several veterans shared stories. The mayor spoke briefly. A local choir sang. Then it was time. Jack stepped forward. The crowd fell silent. He looked at the Mustang, then at Frank, then at Shadow. This was never about a car. His voice carried across the memorial grounds. It was about a son. A pause. A father. Another pause. A promise. The crowd listened. Many already knew the story, yet nobody looked away. Jack continued. Tyler Holloway believed broken things could be rebuilt. His eyes moved toward Shadow, and so do I. Then he grabbed the cover. The crowd held its breath. The fabric slipped away. Gasps echoed across the hillside. The Mustang emerged beneath the afternoon sun. Midnight blue. Flawless. Elegant. Alive. The paint reflected the sky like glass. Chrome gleamed. The engine rumbled softly. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then applause erupted. The sound rolled across the lake, across the mountains, across the years. Frank stood motionless. Tears filled his eyes. He couldn't look away. Not from the car, not from the dream. Jack walked toward him, holding out a single object. The keys. The old rancher's hands trembled. No. Jack smiled. Yes. Frank looked overwhelmed. You should do it. The crowd quietly stepped aside, creating a path. Frank accepted the keys, slowly, carefully, as though they were made of glass. He approached the Mustang, opened the driver's door, and sat inside. The exact same seat where Tyler had once sat. The exact same steering wheel. The exact same dream. The engine started with a deep, powerful rumble. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Frank gripped the wheel, then closed his eyes. For a long moment he simply sat there, breathing, remembering, feeling. When he finally opened his eyes again, tears streamed freely down his face. I can feel him. His voice barely rose above a whisper, yet everyone heard it. I can feel him in here. Silence swept across the crowd. Not sadness, not grief. Something gentler, something healing. Frank drove slowly around the memorial road, the Mustang gliding past the lake, past the flags, past the people whose lives it had touched. When he returned several minutes later, the applause began again, louder this time, stronger. The dream was complete. The promise had been kept. The mission was finished. Or so Jack believed. Because as the crowd slowly dispersed and the sun began sinking toward the mountains, Frank approached him carrying a small, weathered envelope. The old rancher's expression had changed again. Serious, thoughtful, almost nervous. Jack frowned. What is it? Frank looked down at the envelope, then back at him. His voice softened. There's one more thing Tyler left behind. The wind moved gently across the lake. Shadow lifted his head. And somehow, Jack knew the story wasn't over yet. Shadow lifted his head. And somehow, Jack knew the story wasn't over yet. The sun hung low above Hollow Lake. Golden light spilled across the water like liquid fire. Most of the crowd had already left. The Veterans Memorial stood quiet once again. Only a handful of people remained near the Mustang. Frank Holloway stood beside the driver's door, holding a weathered envelope. The old rancher's expression carried something Jack hadn't seen before. Not grief, not relief, responsibility, as though he had been entrusted with something important for a very long time. And now the time had finally come to pass it on. Jack glanced at the envelope. What is it? Frank looked toward the mountains. For a moment he seemed to be gathering strength. Then he handed it over. I've had this for 20 years. Jack frowned. You never opened it? Frank shook his head. No. The answer surprised him. Why not? A faint smile crossed the old rancher's face. Because it wasn't for me. The wind moved gently across the lakeshore. Shadow rose slowly and stood beside Jack. The old German shepherd seemed unusually attentive, watching, waiting, just as he had from the beginning. Jack carefully opened the envelope. Inside was another sealed packet. Legal documents, several pages, and a handwritten letter. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. Tyler Holloway. Jack felt a strange chill. Even after everything that had happened, seeing Tyler's words still carried weight. The young ranger's voice seemed alive in every line. Jack unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly. Then he began reading. If you're holding this letter, then the Mustang is finished. That means two things. First, Dad finally found peace. Second, somebody cared enough to finish what I started. Jack swallowed. The mountains seemed quieter somehow. The lake reflected the evening sky. Everything around him faded as Tyler's words pulled him forward. The letter continued. If you're that person, I need to ask one last favor. Frank lowered his eyes. Shadow sat beside Jack's boots. The world felt suspended between past and present. 20 years collapsed into a single moment. Tyler's next words hit harder than any of them expected. There is 40 acres of land along the South Fork River. Dad knows where it is. Most people think it's just another piece of ranch property. But I always saw something else. Jack looked up. Frank nodded slowly, as if confirming the memory. The letter continued. I wanted to build something there someday. Not a business, not a resort, not a tourist attraction. A place where veterans could breathe. A place where people carrying too much weight could put some of it down. A place where nobody had to explain why they couldn't sleep. Jack stopped reading. His vision blurred slightly. The words felt personal, too personal. Tyler had written them years before they ever met. Yet somehow it felt like the young ranger understood him perfectly. Frank quietly looked toward the distant mountains. He talked about it all the time. The old rancher's voice cracked slightly. Said some people come home from war, but never really make it home. Jack couldn't speak, because he knew exactly what Tyler meant. The letter continued. If you're reading this, then maybe you're the person who should build it. Because nobody finishes a dream like this, unless they understand why it matters. The next page contained something unexpected. Property documents. Signed. Notarized. Legal. Official. Jack stared. His heart pounded. What is this? Frank smiled through tears. It's yours. The words hung in the air. Impossible. Unbelievable. Jack looked from the paperwork to Frank, then back again. No. Frank nodded. Yes. I can't take this. The old rancher laughed softly. That's exactly why Tyler wanted you to have it. Jack stared at the documents. 40 acres, river frontage, mountain views, paid in full. Land worth more than anything he had ever owned, more than he had ever imagined owning. The homeless Navy SEAL who had spent years drifting from place to place suddenly found himself holding a future. But the land wasn't what overwhelmed him. It was the reason behind it. Tyler hadn't left a gift. He had left a mission. One final mission. The lake reflected the final colors of sunset. Orange, purple, gold. Shadow rested beside Jack. The old dog looked completely at peace, as if everything had led to this moment. Frank placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. My son believed people deserved second chances. The old rancher's voice softened. I think he would have liked you. For several seconds, Jack couldn't respond, because nobody had said something like that to him in a very long time, maybe ever. The following months changed everything. Spring arrived in Montana. Snow disappeared from the valleys. Wildflowers returned. The South Fork River ran strong and clear through the property Tyler had left behind. The land was beautiful, exactly as Tyler had described. Towering pines, open meadows, mountain views stretching for miles, a place that felt untouched by time. Jack visited almost every day. At first, he simply walked the property with Shadow, thinking, planning, dreaming, the same things Tyler had once done. Then the work began. Slowly, one step at a time. Volunteers appeared almost immediately. Veterans, neighbors, friends from Elk Ridge, people who had followed the Mustang story, people who believed in the dream. A workshop came first, then a gathering space, then small cabins. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy. Just a place where people could heal, a place where nobody had to carry their burdens alone. The project became known as Holloway Ridge, named after the young ranger whose dream had survived him. By summer, veterans began arriving. Some stayed for a weekend, others stayed longer. Many came carrying invisible wounds, the same wounds Jack knew all too well. For the first time in years, he found himself helping others instead of simply surviving. Teaching mechanics, sharing coffee, listening. Sometimes listening was enough. The workshop became its own kind of therapy. People rebuilt engines, repaired tractors, restored old trucks, and somewhere in the process, they began rebuilding themselves. Exactly as Tyler had hoped. One warm evening nearly a year later, Jack stood outside the workshop watching the sunset. The restored Mustang sat parked beneath a wooden shelter. Its midnight blue paint glowed beneath the fading light. Several younger veterans laughed nearby while working on a pickup truck. The sound echoed across the property. Alive, hopeful, human. Shadow lay beneath the Mustang. Older now, slower, but content. The old German shepherd had become something of a legend. Everyone knew his story. Everyone knew none of this would exist without him. Jack walked over and scratched behind the dog's ears. Shadow opened one eye. His tail thumped softly against the ground. Good work, partner. The dog sighed happily. The mountains beyond the river turned purple as darkness approached. Jack looked around. The workshop, the veterans, the cabins, the land, the future. Then his gaze settled on the Mustang, the rusted relic he had purchased with his last $600. A terrible investment, the best decision of his life. Because it had never really been about the car. It was about a father finding peace, a son keeping his promise, a veteran finding purpose, a community discovering hope, and a loyal dog who refused to stop digging until the truth was found. The river moved quietly through the valley. The stars began appearing overhead, and as the first lights illuminated Holloway Ridge, Jack Mercer finally understood something. Some dreams don't end when people leave this world. Sometimes they simply wait for the right person to carry them the rest of the way. Beside him, Shadow closed his eyes. The Mustang rested nearby, and beneath the Montana sky, Tyler Holloway's dream continued driving forward, not as a memory, but as a living legacy. The end. But as a living legacy. The end. If you believe loyalty, hard work, and keeping your word still matter, comment 1. If you think people should never give up on a dream worth fighting for, comment 0. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or land. It's the chance to help someone else stand back up. And if you enjoy stories about justice, dignity, perseverance, and the American spirit, subscribe and join us for the next journey.